Greetings, everyone, and welcome to our webcast today on pandemic-related credit risk. My name is Catherine Baxter. I am your moderator for today's event, and we have a wonderful program for you today. I think you're all going to enjoy it. But before I introduce my host and we get started in the webinar, let's do a few housekeeping items. Please adjust your volume because we want you to hear the entire webinar clearly. So if you need to put the volume all the way up, please do so. To resize these slides, simply drag to the right corner. From this website, you will need to allow pop-ups. And there's a feature on your console that says Ask a Question. Please ask questions throughout this webinar. Don't wait until the end, because we want to be able to address as many questions as we can during the webinar. And as always, in approximately 3 weeks, the webinar will be closed captioned for on-demand viewing in our learning management service. Now, we have a disclaimer that we must read before we proceed. The materials presented in this webinar are intended as an informative and educational summary of general credit risk information. The NCUA has taken reasonable measures to ensure the quality of the data and other information produced by the NCUA that is available in this presentation. The NCUA, however, makes no warranty, express or implied, nor assumes any legal liability or responsibility for the accuracy, correctness, or completeness of any information that is available through this presentation, nor represent that its use would not infringe on privately owned rights. The slides are intended for educational and discussion purposes and do not constitute legal advice nor replace independent professional judgment. Reference to any specific commercial product, process, or service by trade name, trademark, manufacturer, or otherwise does not constitute an endorsement, recommendation, or favoring by the U.S. government or the NCUA. As I mentioned, this is a very dynamic presentation that we have. Before we get started, we want to get an idea of who is in our audience. Now, in front of you on your screen, you see we have a slide that says which asset range represents your credit union. Click on one of these radio buttons. In the asset range of 0 to 50 million, 51 to 250 million, 251 to 1 billion. Are you greater than 1 billion? And we also recognize that if let us know, who do we have in our audience today? 0 to 50, 51 to 250, 251 to 1 billion, greater than 1 billion, or not a credit union. Use those radio buttons on the screen. Let's see what we have. Okay, great. We have quite a mixture today. We have quite a few that are in, our largest category seems to be in the greater than 1 billion, but it's followed by the 51 to 1 billion and the 250 to 250 million. But we have a nice selection of who we have today. I'm getting ready to turn over the webinar to our speaker, who is Victoria Bennett. She's a senior credit specialist with the Office of Examination and Insurance. Please pay close attention to what Victoria says. Very interesting information. Victoria, you have our attention.
Well, thank you very much, Catherine. And good morning or good afternoon to everyone who's out there, depending on where you are. And for our topics today, in part of this credit risk presentation, we're going to be covering things like the status of the credit market, including where are the biggest trouble spots. We'll do a short update on current regulations. We'll talk a little bit about what your NCUA examiner is looking for. And just as a little background, I've been with NCUA for 26 years. I spent 4 years as a problem case officer and the last 10 years as a regional lending specialist. So hopefully I've got an idea of what your examiner is looking for, although I don't guarantee that I'll be able to hit everything that they're going after. We're going to give you some suggestions on how to report risk to management and to your board. And we'll talk about proactively dealing with credit risk, including some hints and tips on what you can do. But I want to start this off also with a question, so I hope you'll indulge me. I'd like to know what you believe will happen to your local economy in 2021. And this is your local economy. So do you believe it'll improve a lot? It'll get a little better. It'll stay about the same as it is now. It'll deteriorate, but not by much, or it's going to deteriorate a lot. So I really want to know what's going on with you locally so that I can get a feel for where you're all seeing what's going on with you. So I'll give you a minute to go ahead and click on these answers, and we'll see what you all think. And given that we've got such a wide range of how everyone's economies are going, this might be an interesting answer. Oh, I'll go ahead and click on this and see what happens. And it looks like everyone, or the majority of folks, think that it's going to get a little better. More than 50%, wow. A solid number think that it's going to either stay the same as it is or it'll improve a lot. Not many people, interestingly enough, only about 12%, 13% think that things are going to deteriorate. So, boy, I hope you're right. Let's start off, though, by talking about credit markets in the U.S. Commercial loans are a serious concern right now, primarily because there is a sea change in how businesses are practicing. We are, of course, understanding now that businesses know they can do a lot more remotely. There's been a substantial amount of reduction in business travel. There's been a huge drop in demand in office space because people are working from home. This in turn has impacted service businesses within the office areas, restaurants and such are less needed. So given that so much of this is centered in commercial real estate, and also given the fact that almost 92% of federally insured credit unions' commercial loans are secured by real estate, this is something that I want to focus on a little bit. Of course, that includes office space, retail, restaurants, storage facilities, hotels. There's a wide range. Let's start off by taking a look at U.S. office vacancy rates. Now, the blue line on top are the premium office spaces, 4 and 5 star. And you can see towards the mid to late teens, the vacancy rate kind of stabilized at about 12% or so. But the overall U.S. rate, which is the green line, and the orange line, which is the U.S. 3-star, the mid-range properties, continue to drop in their office vacancy rates. And then, of course, you can see what happened in 2020. Now, according to CoStar, the United States lost 1.2 million office jobs in 2020, and that's not projected to come back until 2022 at least. As a result, sublease office space is now at 200 million square feet. And to give you a comparison on that, the Twin Towers at 110 stories each had a total combined square footage of about 10 million. So we're looking at sublease office space of 20 sets of Twin Towers. Now, the problem with this, of course, is the fact that it directly competes with office space that might be offered by your borrowers if they have office loans, and also those properties that are just coming online if you've had recent construction on office buildings. You might think that subleased office space is not so much a competitor because of the remaining term of the leases, but 44% of the leases nationwide have an average remaining term of more than 36 months. So really, they are going head-to-head with the empty spaces that your borrowers might have. Next, we'll talk about retail space a little bit. Of course, not all retailers are in distress. Discounters, general merchandise, pharmacies, home improvement, groceries. I can't find a parking space at Costco. So there's a lot of them that are not having trouble. But of course, others have been affected. Shopping malls, hugely. 75% of the population avoided shopping malls in the last year because of coronavirus. Specialty retailers as well. Williams-Sonoma last week announced they were going to close a quarter of their brick and mortars because of online shopping growth. They are seeing a churn from the brick and mortars to people shopping online. And I don't think it'll be a surprise to anyone that online shopping increased 44% in the second quarter of 2020 compared to a year prior. Multifamily housing. Now, of course, this is 5 units and above. The cap rate, and for anyone who might not be familiar, the cap rate, when the cap rate declines, the value of the property goes up. It's an inverse relationship. So as you see in this, the cap rate is declining on all 3 bars: 3-star properties, the United States as a whole, the green line, and then the blue line, the 4- and 5-star, the primo properties. So the cap rates have been declining, so the values are increasing, flattened out in 2020, and they're anticipating that that's going to decline again. Now, my concern is that we've got additional influences that might alter those projections. And that would be, first off, you can see how radically in this next graph multifamily housing sales have changed. You can see fourth orange bar from the right. You can see that it dropped dramatically in the second quarter. But interestingly, you can also see how it rose again in the fourth quarter of 2020. And of course, they're anticipating it's going to drop even worse in the first quarter of 2021. This is because there is such a diversity within the markets. New York was down 75% from their 5-year sales average. San Francisco Bay Area was down 60% in 2020. But other areas, Atlanta, Phoenix, or Fort Worth, were the highest volume markets. So we had other markets compensating for what was going on in some of the really distressed areas. But the thing that I was alluding to previously is the issue that doesn't seem to be reflected yet in these graphs, and that is where we have borrowers with renters who haven't paid. Moody's Analytics estimates 9.4 million households owe an average of $5,600 each in back rent, utilities, and late fees, which total more than $50 billion. That's a B. Now, I've seen a wide range of estimates from a variety of sources, but all of them are into the tens of billions of dollars. Rectifying this back rent is not going to be easy. Evictions are a problem, and we'll talk about that in a moment with the updated regulations. But the continued increase in the value of these properties may well be impacted by the restrictions on evictions and also what's going on with the back rent. Then let's take a quick look at travel tourism and commercial real estate. With this graph, also from CoStar, you can see that we've got red, orange, green, and blue areas. It's based upon an index, which is the revenue per available room as of the current time compared to the same week in 2019. So for the red areas, that's areas exhibiting depression, where the index is less than 50%. So the revenue per available room is less than 50% what it was in 2019. Orange, recession, is between 50 and 79.9. Recovery, which is the green, is between 80 and 99.9, and peak is above 100. You can see, of course, on the far left, the first week in March of last year, things were going gangbusters. More than 35% of the market was doing better than it was the same week in 2019. And then, of course, April hit. That was dreadful. You can see now that the orange is growing dramatically, and that's great. But one thing to remember with this chart is that the range is from 50 to 79.9%. So the average nationwide as of the week of March 14th was $53.45 for revenue per available room. Now, when you compare that to the prior year, 2 years prior in the case of 2019, that's only 57% compared to the same week in 2019. You can see Those that are in the recessionary area are on the very low side. So they've got a way to go before they're going to get into the green. That orange is going to stay orange for a while. Areas that had the greatest demand were the Florida Keys, Fort Lauderdale, Miami. So Florida is doing great. Other states that are recovering are, Arizona, Texas, Alabama, Mississippi. Sounds to me like it's primarily snowbird states that have more relaxed regulations when it comes to masking, etc. In terms of the areas that are struggling, Oahu only had 30% occupancy, and Minneapolis only had 31% occupancy as of mid-February. But I would say that that's not really unexpected given the travel difficulties over to Hawaii and the weather. I also want to throw something out there for credit unions that might have hotel properties in their portfolios. Please understand, I'm not endorsing a product, but I would say to you that if you've got hotel properties, inquire as to whether they receive the STAR reports, if you haven't already. It's a free service, and it's an excellent tool for taking a look at your loans and how the collateral is performing. The vast majority of hotel owners actually do participate in the STAR program. So please find out about that and see if you can get the STAR reports on your properties. So next I'm going to move into consumer. As of the beginning of January 2021, for real estate, 5.5% of homeowners are in forbearance, about 2.7 million, according to the Mortgage Bankers Association. That is down from a high of 8.5% in June of 2020. Of course, the interest rates that were going on last year really fired this up. So we had a lot of people that were able to deal with situations because they were able to refinance. And existing single-family residence prices in all metro areas increased in the fourth quarter of 2020. 88% of those were double-digit increases. Vacation home localities also had large increases, I think, as people understood that if they were going to be working remotely, you could work in some nice places. So I think that really had an impact. But overall, the year-over-year average was an increase of 15%. In regard to other consumer loans, we are looking at the possibility, if not probability, of a K-shaped recovery. For anyone who's not familiar, that's where the economy takes a real dive, as it did, and then the recovery splits. So some parts of the economy recovers and goes up, other parts go down or stagnate. CNBC indicated that this has been ramping up for decades, but the pandemic is bringing it into sharp focus. Whether or not you agree with that, we're certainly seeing that the lower income individuals are having a harder time, whereas the higher income individuals are finding it easier to do remote work, etc. We're having a hard time quantifying what kind of an impact the pandemic is having on consumer loans. Experian indicates that the CARES Act likely contributed to the decline in delinquency rates because, I don't know about you, but I've seen an awful lot of institutions have declines in consumer real estate because of financial assistance to consumers, federal credit union collections were halted, and reporting loans as current to the credit bureaus. So we're not having the same situation as we had in the Great Recession, where so many people had trouble because of what happened. And it was reported to the credit union as difficulty. But then as we came out of it, we understood and we kind of gave some grace to people who had been in the throes of the Great Recession. With this, we've got a lot of loans that are being reported as current while they have CARES extensions. Also, NCUA does not track separately, does not require you at this point to separately report your CARES Act commercial and consumer loans. So we really don't have a good handle on it. So given that commercial loans have so much of the attention, what I'd like to do is I'd like to ask you if you'd be kind enough to let me know, if you're aware, how much of your consumer portfolio received CARES Act forbearances. Understanding these are anonymous, we can't track back as to who's answering what. So if you could let me know, has your consumer portfolio received between 0 and 15% forbearances, 15 to 30, 30 to 45, or 45% and above? Or for those of us you might not know, or we've got a fair number of examiners on this call, so if you're not a credit union. So if you could do that for me, I'd really appreciate it. And I'm very interested to see the answer on this one. And I'll give you another minute more to go ahead and answer it.
Say, Victoria, can I interrupt you for 1 minute?
Yes, ma'am. You betcha.
I'd like to also ask, thank you. I'd like to ask the audience too, as we're going along in the webinar, there is a survey in your queue or on your platform. Please let us know how you're enjoying this particular webinar as we get towards the end, and also if you have any recommendations for us. Back to you, Victoria.
Oh, absolutely. I'd love to hear your recommendations. Criticisms are always welcome. So let's see what's happened. 0 to 15% is the huge winner, as I thought it would be, 56.9%. We've got 15 to 30% at right around 8%. I'd be willing to bet that that's on the lower side of the 15 to 30%, but okay. And then we've got a small number of credit unions that have a larger percentage. If I had to guess, I would say that those are probably smaller credit unions. And then, of course, we've got a third of the audience as don't know or not a credit union. Okay, well, thank you for that. So next, let's talk a little bit about changes to the regulations. First off, I want to touch on federally backed mortgage extensions. Non-enterprise for federally backed mortgages, which are VA, FHA, USDA, they got an additional 6 months in addition to the original 12 months for pandemic-related hardship. And also the enterprise, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, also now have 18-month totals. And the additional forbearance that they gave, the additional 3 months as of the end of February, is only applicable to those in a COVID forbearance plan as of February 28th, 2021. And there may be other limits that apply. However, these allow borrowers to repay the missed payments when the loan is sold, refinanced, or at mortgage maturity, so they don't have to worry about actually catching up with those delinquent payments, or forborne payments, excuse me. Of course, this does not include the vast majority of the loans portfolioed in your credit union. So your loans that are on your books, you decide what the extensions are, of course, but the parameters are reviewed by your examiner. The eviction moratorium, this one is a tough one. It's due to expire as of March 31st. However, this morning's Washington Post indicates that the CDC sent a proposal to the Office of Management and Budget for regulatory review. That happened last Thursday, which makes it seem likely that they will extend the eviction moratorium. I would not be at all surprised if we didn't hear that in the next couple of days. However, there are some district courts, U.S. district courts, where the moratorium has been challenged and even declared unconstitutional in Iowa, Tennessee, Ohio, and it's also being fought elsewhere. Atlanta has got a lawsuit going on. My concern with this is that we've got small investors in real estate. The credit unions have borrowers who have, say, 1, 2, 3 single-family residences, and we no longer consider non-owner occupied single-family residences or 1 to 4 unit properties as business loans, so we're not tracking those. But the borrowers, which are not uncommon, may be reliant upon the income from these rentals. So while a payment modification might help, they may also be missing out on the income as well. According to the 2018 Rental Housing Finance Survey, 40% of residential units are owned by individual investors. And of these, landlords earning $50,000 or less, on average, their property income accounts for 20% of the household income. So your borrowers who have non-owner occupied, especially if they're lower income, they may very well be reliant upon that income from those rental properties. And if those folks are not paying their loans and they're in the eviction moratorium arena, we've got some serious concerns with those. Now, enterprise loans, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they're not able to have evictions until June 30th, at least. All evictions are as of March 31st, as I was saying earlier. It may change. Oops, excuse me, I'm not going to talk. And also, I wanted to bring up that some localities have stricter eviction moratoriums. California, Oregon, Washington have moratoriums through June 30th, and Maryland and DC have moratoriums through the end of the crisis. So the eviction moratorium is really going to have an impact on our rental properties. Then next, let's talk about these PPP loans. As we're all aware, we're in the second round. When I was a regional lending specialist last year, I just want to say I was so impressed by the credit unions with which I had contact. Your staff, and I'm sure this is true throughout the country, your staff worked weekends, through the night sometimes. They worked very long hours to make sure that both your existing members and new members had the assistance that they needed to survive what was going on. And I was humbled and awed by what I saw. You guys just are so excellent. And I just want to say to those folks that worked on the PPP loans, you're terrific. You're just amazing. So with this next round, $162 billion has been approved between mid-January and early March. Credit unions provided $3 billion of those approvals, 65,000 loans you all have done. And 84% of the balances on the second round have less than $100,000. So y'all are reaching the very smallest proprietors and businesses, and I think that's awesome. Other changes to the regulations. The extension of TDR guidance, the big one. Just going back to cover a little bit what we had from the beginning, you do not need to report your CARES Act forbearances as troubled debt restructures if the modification is in response to the COVID event, the borrower was no more than 30 days past due as of December 31st, 2019, and the extension was executed between March 1st and what is now January 2nd, 2022. What about the subsequent forbearances? We've given a forbearance. They're coming back and they're saying they need another one. What do we do? Is it okay? Well, it depends. If it meets the prior requirements, the regulation is still in effect, but you must understand the risk in your portfolio, regardless of how your risk-graded loans. Excuse me. If you recall, for commercial loans, you are not required to regrade those loans because of the CARES Act. If you are not regrading them, you need to be reporting them appropriately to your board and senior management and tracking them. You must understand the risk. So documentation is essential, tracking is required. You must communicate the risk to senior management and the board, as I just said, and you must reserve appropriately. So the implication with the allowance account, with your loans being reserved and accounted for on the allowance, it hasn't changed, but it is all the more important as time goes on. It is especially important that your pools have similar loans within them. So for example, if you're giving a CARES extension to someone who's got an indirect loan, you want to make sure that they're in the appropriate pool. They shouldn't necessarily be in the general pool. You want a separate pool for CARES Act indirect loans. So make sure your pools are right. You need to be realistic, of course, about loss potential. And of course, you need to follow ASC subtopic 310-40. So moving into, what is NCUA looking for? When we get an examiner in our credit union, what's that person going to be looking at? Well, first of all, we want to know how you are proactively dealing with your credit risk. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. We want to see your documentation on it. Who, what, when, where, why, and how. I had this crammed into my head in elementary school. It's a great way, though, to document what you've got going on. So really give us the details. And if in doubt, document it. We're going to want to know how strong your capital and earnings are. If you're dealing with high credit risk or elevated credit risk, your capital and earnings, of course, are what's going to carry you through. We're also going to look to see if you're getting into new high-risk programs. Sounds too good to be true, because we're concerned about the possibility that we could have credit unions who might be suffering and they're looking to get fast income. So those new programs that you get into, if they're higher risk, they especially need to be well documented. I'm not telling you to not get into new programs by any stretch, but you do need to document what you're doing. With managing your risk, considering ways to report your CARES extensions. I assume that everyone is, at this point, reporting your CARES extensions to some degree or another. One of the things that I saw last year, though, when I was out in the credit unions, was a difficulty in reporting commercial loans so that you could really see the risk stratified out. And this was something that I suggested to some of the credit unions that I went into. For your commercial loans, because it's not just one bucket of commercial loans, you've got all of the various risk grades in there. And this is hypothetical. I made these numbers up. I hope nobody's quite at this level of having 60% of your portfolio in CARES modifications, but you never know. This would show management and the board that 44% of your loans are rated as satisfactory, but they also have COVID modifications. So they have an additional layer of risk that may not be accounted for in the satisfactory grade. Now, while you are able to leave your grades static for the COVID modifications, I would encourage you not to do so. You are well within your rights to rescore your modifications to wherever you see the risk. That's something that your examiners are going to be looking at. But we recognize that you are entitled to keep them at the prior CARES Act levels. But consider how you're reporting. So if you're not going to rescore them, at the very least, let your board and senior management know how much you've got in CARES Act modifications. You could also spread this out a little bit and maybe provide the number of CARES Act modifications that have matured and they've gone back. So you've got a separate column showing the ones that were affected. You could also include delinquencies. We expect that you are reporting COVID modifications, delinquencies to your board, but it could be added into this kind of a graph if you choose. But it's just a suggestion. Other proactive steps that you can take, understanding that these suggestions are from my days as a problem case officer. These are not required. They're suggestions for you, things that you might think about. Take from it what you will. My biggest suggestion to you is if you believe that you may have a problem, if there is a potential, and even if not, even if it's just a what if, develop a plan. What are you going to do in the event that you get into a bad situation from the COVID loans or from the pandemic situation in recovery? The big concern is when a bad situation is getting worse. It's human nature to hope that things will improve, and I certainly saw that on more than one occasion. It'll get better tomorrow. It'll be better tomorrow. But tomorrow never comes, and the hole keeps getting bigger. So by having a plan with stop-loss triggers in your plan, so for example, when delinquencies reach this amount, we will have an outside company come in and maybe take over the short-term delinquencies to do the collections so that we can focus on the others. Or worse yet, if your losses reach a certain level, we will start doing this, this, and this, reduce our expenses so that we protect our capital. So the importance of putting together this kind of a plan now, while you are not in stress over the situation, it allows you to set when you will cock the gun and when you will fire the gun, so that you don't get into that situation of hoping, 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 and then all of a sudden it's worse than you're able to get out of. I hope none of you get into that situation. I genuinely do. But it is a good way to protect yourself in the event that does happen. Communications, when you're taking proactive steps, are essential. Polling your staff to know who's concerned about their readiness in the event that there is going to be some problems, or as you start to have problems. One of the things I saw when I was a problem case officer was the fact that we had staff coming to us and saying, I just don't understand what I'm supposed to do, or I don't understand what is happening, whatever. But find out if your staff needs to know additional information in order to be ready if their delinquencies start to go up, whatever. But finding out what your staff's readiness level is. Talking to your examiners if you need us. There's the old adage of we're from the government and we're here to help you. But genuinely, really, we will help you if we can, to whatever extent we're able. So please, if you're running into trouble, let us know. Are your policies up to date? Now, I would assume that everybody's workout policy is up to date at this point, whether it's TDR or not. But also other policies in the event that you need them. Foreclosure and repossession for commercial and consumer loans. And if you take nothing away from this, or with regard to foreclosure and policies, really the one thing I want you to get, real estate agents are not property managers. I had that happen so often, 2008, 2009, 2010, where credit unions felt that they had a bunch of foreclosed properties and they thought that the real estate agents were the property managers. They are not. If you have multiple foreclosed properties, you need someone assigned, internal or external, to make sure that the properties are well maintained. When you consider such things as potential squatters, theft, we had copper pipes, air conditioners, appliances, fixtures, all kinds of things disappear. And other maintenance, such as weed abatement. Certainly had a few credit unions get fined for not keeping the weed abatement going on. Also, you need insurance on vacant properties. And getting the neighbor's phone number is a fabulous idea. Back in 2009, I personally had a property right near to me where I tried to find the banker who owned the property because they had broken windows, etc., and they really needed to get on that. So going out there and actually handing out your business card is not a bad idea. Identifying outside assistance early. Workout specialists for commercial loans. They may very well be in high demand in the future, and it's very important that you do your due diligence regarding their experience and ability. Excess collections capacity. First off, are you fully staffed up? Start cross-training now. A couple credit unions I saw did very well when they had to pull tellers off the lines and use them for collections. So having the cross-training done and they're ready to go if they're needed is an excellent thing. I also really like the idea that employees understand different parts of your organization so they really see where they fit and how things fit together and how things work. I think it's a great thing. And then external, identifying companies who could help if you need it. Other ideas, other specialized assistants, attorneys, particularly with relevant experience. Please, please, please do not use a personal injury attorney to foreclose on that major property. How healthy are your servicers? Some of you may remember back in 2012, a major participation originator failed. Since then, most contracts for participations have indicated how to deal with a servicer failure. However, it could still cause disruptions if it happens. And also doing due diligence on your servicers. You need to know, one, if they're healthy and they're going to be staying in business in the future, and if not, what you're going to do about it early, because the earlier the better, of course. But also, you need to be tracking to see if they're performing collections, for example. Something, when I was an examiner, I would ask to see collection notes on participations, and every so often I'd get a blank look, and someone would say to me, we don't do the collections. That's done by the originator, the servicer. And it's like, but you don't check? You don't find out what they're doing? So it's important to keep a watch on what's going on. Next, receivers. A receiver is an individual appointed by the court, usually at the request of the lender, to act as a neutral third party to do as the court instructs, not as the lender or the borrower want them to do. And the importance of a receiver is it allows the lender to avoid mortgagee in possession status. Translated into English, that means that if the lender acts as an owner, collects the rent, pays the bills, the credit union is subject to the same liability exposure as the owner. So lawsuits for personal injury, environmental violations, whatever else, if you have a receiver in place, it's on them, not on you. It sounds like a great idea, but it's only used in the very largest cases because it's very expensive. A receiver can run you $300 to $500 an hour. And then with the other ideas, performing regression analysis if possible. Regression analysis allows you to look for possible predictors for delinquency, default, loss ratios. And for anyone who might not be familiar, regression analysis uses statistics to find trends. So for example, you might guess that there's a connection between what you eat and what you weigh. They call it the freshman 15 and the COVID-19. I don't know about you, but I'm struggling with it. Regression analysis helps you to quantify that kind of thing by giving you data points and then helping you find the trend that's going on with those data points. What-if scenarios are also helpful, and I'm sure most, if not all of you, are familiar with what-ifs because of your ALCOs, but just to make sure, using the what-if scenarios, for example, you might anticipate that 20% of your CARES modifications will default. If you expect 40% losses on those defaulted loans, what's your ultimate loss? And what is the effect on your capital? It can also be used to predict funding for your allowance, staffing needs, expenses, etc. And then you build these results into that plan that I talked about to trigger those predetermined responses if certain situations occur. Next, I'd like to talk about the Waterfall Method. This was something that I saw used quite a bit during the Great Recession. And I'll first of all talk about the consumer method, and then I'll touch on commercial. But it's a very simplistic explanation of a waterfall, and that's Bridal Veil in Yosemite, and I love Yosemite. The idea with a waterfall is that you determine the least amount of assistance to help the borrower recover. So that's protecting your capital, but also helping the borrower. We want to help the borrower as much as we can, but you all need to stay protected as well. When you give the modifications, please remember you can always give a second or third modification. So what I saw at the beginning of the Great Recession was that people gave 1, 2, 3 years or more of modifications. That's excessive. You want to keep it fairly short term so that if the borrower's situation changes, you can revert to the original terms of the loan. But when you're doing the modification, when you're figuring out how much to give them, You first of all start with your board's most liberal acceptable limit for highest debt-to-income ratio. So, for example, if your standard debt-to-income ratio limit is 45 or 50%, that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for your highest debt-to-income ratio that your board can palatably swallow, that you think that a borrower will be able to do if they were in distress. Whether that's 55% or more, that's something you need to determine and justify and document. Then look at the longest amortization term, not the longest modification, but the longest amortization term that you'll accept. Then look at the lowest interest rate that the board will accept, understanding that 0 is almost always, I'm not going to say always, but in general, 0 is a charge-off. You're going to give somebody a 0 interest rate, that loan should be charged off and you take recoveries, okay? Not always, though. I'm willing to concede on that. Next, you want to get a before and after budget from your borrower, okay? Now, this should include everything: miscellaneous expenses, eating out, Starbucks, cell phone, ballet lessons for the kids, everything. And then an after forbearance budget showing what the borrower is willing to do in order to buy in on this modification. So what are they willing to give up? And you need to make sure that the budget is reasonable. If it's not reasonable, it's not going to work. You've got to have something that's reasonable. Then once you've got the budget together, figure out the debt ratio. This may, in fact, even be a net debt ratio that you're using. Really, the only time that I've seen net debt ratios used have been when using the Waterfall Method, or probably 25 years ago, I was seeing net debt ratios in a few small credit unions, but otherwise it's pretty rare. But one way or the other, figuring out their debt ratio. Does it meet the highest debt ratio? Because if it doesn't, you need to extend the amortization next. You need to move to the next segment of the waterfall and figure out if the extended amortization lowers the payment enough to meet the debt ratio limit. Finally, if that doesn't help enough, lower the interest rate. So you're going to the next step of the waterfall. Then, if that doesn't work, consider an AB note, or consider the possibility that perhaps this is not going to work out at all, that you need to do something else, but that a modification is not going to work. I would also say, if you approve a modification beyond the limits that you have, document why. So, for example, someone comes to you and says, my mom is going to pay the mortgage until I get a job. Yippee! I think that's a wonderful thing. Don't give up a modification that's going to work just because it's a little bit outside of what your guidelines are. Document what you did and help the member by all means, but document what happened. Really, we're looking to mitigate your losses more than anything, okay? Then for commercial loans, what I would also recommend is that you get such items as a business plan. A business plan, in my definition, is something for the next year, what they intend to do, what they see. A strategic plan. Now, this could be very loose and very short, but strategic plan, to my definition, being 3 to 5 years. Where do they see themselves in the future? So that can be very simplistic, but at least get an idea of where they think they're going. Current information on principals. If you had 4 people as principals on that commercial loan, and 2 of them have absconded, you need to know that, and you need to know all of their current information. You also need to know information on the guarantors, on whether the guarantors are willing to pony up, of course. You need information on tenants, customers, suppliers, current rent rolls, that kind of thing. And then after you've got that, set a debt coverage ratio minimum. You might want to do that beforehand, but having a set debt coverage ratio minimum, understanding that 1.0 or less is not going to cover the loan, or 1.0 is going to cover the loan, but it's anything below that is not going to cover the payments. So you need a minimum debt coverage ratio, just like you have a maximum debt to income ratio. Then I would suggest you consider a debt coverage ratio maximum. So you've got a range of acceptable earnings. So if during the modification period, the borrower's circumstances improve and they start earning more than the maximum, so their hotel starts filling up, all of these people who are tired of being locked down and living in their houses and want to get out on the road, all of a sudden their hotel is busting at the seams and they have a debt coverage ratio of 1.95. That difference during the modification period goes into a sweep account or some kind of an extra account that the borrowers can't touch. And then that money is paid down to the principal or wherever you believe it needs to go, whether it's fees, whatever you need to pay, as defined in the modification agreements. I would recommend you get legal assistance when you're writing these documents, but consider the idea that you protect yourselves by having a debt ratio minimum and maximum. So we've had a whole lot of ideas running around in here. And I'm going to bring this back by asking another poll question, if I may, and finding out, once again, it's anonymous, how prepared do you feel if the economy does deteriorate? We're ready. Preparations are in process, and we should be okay. We have some work to do, or we're concerned about whether we're going to be able to handle it. Or, of course, not applicable, not a credit union. So if you could answer that for me, that would be great. And then after we get through this, we'll get into some question and answers.
And we have so quite a few.
Oh, do we? Okay, then. Well, I'll do my best.
Oh, yes, we do.
Okay, so let's take a look and see. So we've got people, it looks like most of you are either ready or you've got preparations in process and you're going to be okay. There are a few of you that look like you've got some work to do. I hope this has helped with getting you ready and giving you some ideas. And so, Catherine, if you want to start throwing some questions at me, we can do that if you like.
Absolutely. We have quite a few questions. Again, we'd like to remind our audience to please fill out a survey at the end. Yes, the slide deck is downloadable. It's in your queue on your platform. You can download it now. And again, we're going to post this in our LMS once it is closed captioned. So, Victoria, I'm going to give you the first question. This one is a little different. It's sort of a four-parter. I think what they wanted to do is get all of their questions in at once. But it's all related. So I'm going to ask you,
okay.
If you need me to repeat it, don't worry about that. So here's the question.
Okay.
They said, the audience member said, what will happen to single-family residences in 2021 and 2022? That's the first part of the question. And then the second part says, will delinquent, you want to answer it one at a time? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd rather do that. If I knew what was going to happen to single-family residences in 2021 and 2022, I would be on a beach in Tahiti.
I know, that's right.
Right? Because I'd be playing the lotto. All indications are that SFRs are doing gangbusters, but I do not have the magic crystal ball. I just don't know. What's the second part, Catherine?
That you led into the second part because they said, will delinquency rise after the moratoriums are lifted?
I think it might.
That's the second part.
Okay. I wouldn't be surprised. I don't know that percentage that was given. The fact that we've currently, or at the beginning of the year, we had a little over 5% in delinquencies, modifications, excuse me. I wouldn't be at all surprised if that's not low. I would guess that it's higher than that, but we'll see. I don't know. Okay.
So here's the third part of the question. They said, will it, talking about the delinquency or the single-family residences, Will it create a glut on the market and drive down values and loan to value?
You know, my house is worth more now than it was in 2006. I
Right.
hope it doesn't. But once again, Tahitian beach, pina coladas, nice.
I know, you just can't predict that. So then they wanted to say, they asked the question, and this is what you were addressing, how are credit unions preparing for this? And go ahead, you can answer that part too, what you were saying in your presentation.
You know, I think that as this pandemic continues, preparations are becoming more and more important. Now that we're getting the vaccines, and I'm waiting eagerly for mine, things are going to change dramatically, but other things, as I was saying, are not going to change, or they may well shift, like the fact that I think that businesses are going to be working a lot more remotely. So I hope credit unions are preparing, but I also hope they reach out to us in the event that they need the assistance.
Okay. So now, very good. You answered that. So let's go to another question. You ready?
Okay.
That's a good one, too. So they said, what are the reporting best practices for real estate and consumer COVID-assisted loans to highlight credit risk?
You know, part of it is the same as what I suggested with the breaking out the commercial loans. Break out your consumer loans as well. So you've got the breakdown of indirect loans used, indirect new, whatever else, and then split those the same way so that you've got a percentage and a dollar amount of how much you've got in each bucket. How deep you go, like, for example, with your consumer loans, breaking them out into loan type and then by risk score, so by risk grades. If you're doing risk-based lending, you could even go that far. And in fact, I think that would give you some very interesting information. But that's really up to you. But it's important that your board gets that information.
Very good. Now, here's another good question. I think this is a quick question for you. So you mentioned the STAR program. So the
yes.
question was, who sponsors
STR.
the STAR program? Who sponsors it?
Oh, it's actually, STAR is a separate company, but they were just recently bought out by CoStar. If you look under str.com, you can see where the hotel program is, and your borrowers can sign up for it for free, and they get the reports for free. The only thing is that they have to report their own occupancy rates, daily average rates, their RevPAR. So they've got a few things that they have to report, but then they get back a report that shows what the hotels in the neighborhood are doing. So you get information on the direct competition, so you can see how your property is doing compared to everybody else.
Excellent. That's wonderful. Okay,
yeah.
Good tool.
Nice.
So now, here's another question. This is interesting, too, and that's a good question. So credit union says, do you recommend amending workout policies to mention CARES Act when much of the CARES Act practices has an expiration date on it?
I absolutely think you need a CARES Act modification policy. If you don't have one, you should put one into place as soon as you can. I would anticipate that your examiner will be looking for that. I certainly did, and I know many examiners who do. In fact, I don't know that I know any examiners who haven't asked for a CARES Act modification policy. So yes, by all means, please, you should have a policy for that kind of thing.
Excellent. Here's another question, and I want to remind our audience, we are not going to get to all of your questions today, but we will have all of these questions answered and loaded to our learning management service when the webcast is closed caption. So here, I think this is going to be our final question for today, Victoria. So you had
Okay.
mentioned 18 months when you talked about, I think, earlier in the presentation, you mentioned 18 months as for forbearance, I believe it was. And so the credit union says, is it 18 months from the date that the member asked for the extension? That's what they want to find out. Do you remember?
My understanding is that it is an 18-month forbearance for payments. Now, you will need to check that to make doubly sure because I'm not certain, but my understanding is it's 18 months of payment forbearance. So regardless of when they ask for it, they can forbear 18 months. They might be slightly delinquent at the point that they ask. I would hope that you're following up on your loans actively so that you're really making sure that you're on top of these. But in terms of the date that they request it, I think it is more dependent upon the idea that they get 18 months of forbearance.
Okay, great. Well, I think that's it, Victoria. We're not going to have any more time for questions. We want to end. We're just a little bit past 3, and we wanted to end at 3 o'clock.
Sorry.
But we thank everyone for joining us today, and all of the questions that you've submitted will be answered, and you'll be able to view all of these questions in the Learning Management Service once this webinar is closed captioned. But we do thank Victoria Bennett. Victoria, thank you. That was a very interesting and enlightening introduction and presentation that you did. Thank you so much for that. We also want to thank Ron Diento. He's our back office person, and we'd like to thank Ron Good and George Coudoir and Lou Pham for assisting with the Q&A behind the scenes. So everyone, please have a wonderful afternoon. Have a great week, and we'll see you next month for our BSA webinar. Take care.
Thank you.